MA1 Part D. Cost Accounting. Chapter 7. Overhead Costs. The topics that this presentation will cover are 1. Absorption costing. 2. Allocation and apportionment of overheads. 3. Absorption of overheads. 4. Over and under absorption of overheads. 1. Overheads consist of indirect materials, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Under absorption costing principles, production overheads are absorbed into the cost of the product. In absorption costing, first you share out all the production overheads to all the cost centers that incurred the costs, and then from the cost center share out all their overheads to the products. The overhead costs that are in the service cost centers also need to be shared out amongst the production cost centers. 2. The first stage in absorption costing is to allocate the specific production overheads to the individual cost centers, and then the joint expenses, the expenses that are used by multiple cost centers, are apportioned between the cost centers. There is no right or wrong way to apportion the expenses, but the basis for apportionment should be fair. The apportioned amount equals the total expense multiplied by the portion of the cost center, which is divided by the total of the cost center. For an example of allocation and apportionment, see the example on page 123 and 124 of your interactive text study guide. Stop the lecture. Answer the question on page 124 of your interactive text study guide. The next stage in absorption costing is to reapportion the service cost center overheads to the production cost center. The basis of apportionment used is usually based on the use that the production cost center makes of the service cost center. The apportioned amount of the service cost center, multiplied by the portion of the cost center, which is divided by the total of the cost center, equals the amount to be added to the production cost center. For an example of reapportionment of service cost center costs, see the example on page 125 of your interactive text study guide. Stop the lecture. Answer the question on page 125 of your interactive text study guide. 3. The final stage of absorption costing is to calculate the overhead absorption rate, which is usually based on the activity of the department, normally machine hours, or labor hours. For an example of absorption of overheads, see the example on page 126 of your interactive text study guide. Stop the lecture. Answer the question on page 126 of your interactive text study guide. Then the overhead absorption rate is used to cost each product, depending on how many relevant hours each product takes in each production center. For an example of product cost allocation, see the example on page 127 of your interactive text study guide. Stop the lecture. Answer the questions on page 127 of your interactive text study guide. For the correct allocation and apportionment of overhead costs to the correct cost center, all the overhead invoices need to be carefully coded. It is usual to use a predetermined overhead absorption rate in absorption costing. It is usually set by the annual budget, and is based on estimated or budgeted amounts. The reasons that a predetermined rate, which is calculated before the year begins, is used are: goods are produced and sold throughout the year, but many overheads are not known till the end of the year. It would be impractical and inconvenient to wait till the end of the year to decide what the overhead cost should be. An attempt to calculate overhead costs more regularly is possible, but there will still be estimated costs for occasional expenses. The difficulty with this approach is that the overhead cost would fluctuate randomly and could lead to misleading charges for costing purposes. Actual production output might vary from month to month, so the unit rate for the overhead would fluctuate as well, which would lead to administration and control problems. The predetermined overhead absorption rate is calculated as follows. The overheads that are likely to occur are estimated. Then the total hours, units, or costs are estimated. And finally the estimated overheads are divided by the budgeted activity level to give us the absorption rate. Therefore, the absorption rate equals the budgeted overheads divided by the budgeted level of activity. There are a number of absorption bases, or overhead recovery rates that can be used. These are a few examples. A percentage of direct labor cost. A percentage of direct materials cost. A percentage of prime cost, which is the sum of all direct costs. A rate per machine hours, which is appropriate in departments where production is controlled by machines. A rate per direct labor hours, which is appropriate in a department that is labor intensive. A rate per unit would be effective if all units were identical. For an example of overhead absorption bases, see the example on page 130 of your interactive text study guide. An overabsorption of overheads happens when the budgeted overheads are greater than actual overheads incurred. An underabsorption of overheads happens when the budgeted overheads are less than actual overheads incurred. The following are reasons for over or underabsorbed overheads. The actual overheads are different from the budgeted overheads. The actual activity level is different from the budgeted activity level. Or both the actual overheads and activity level are different from the budget. The double entries for over or under absorption are: overabsorbed, debit, overhead control account, credit, income statement, as a cost to compensate for the overabsorption, underabsorbed, debit, income statement, as a cost to compensate for the underabsorption, credit, overhead control account. Marginal costing is an alternative method of accounting for profit and costs, which does not take into account the absorption of overhead costs. In marginal costing, the closing inventory is valued at the marginal production cost. In absorption costing, the closing inventory is valued at the full production cost, including a share of the fixed production costs. In marginal costing, fixed costs are charged in full against the profit of the period in which they occurred. In absorption costing, the effect is that cost of sales will include some fixed overheads from the previous period, in opening inventory, and cost of sales will exclude some fixed overheads from the current period, in closing inventory. A profit statement using the marginal costing system will be: sales, less variable costs, equals, contribution. Contribution, less fixed costs, equals net profit. A profit statement using the absorption costing system will be: sales, less production cost, equals gross profit. Gross profit less selling, distribution and administration overheads, equals net profit. This is the end of Chapter 7. What will follow next is the quick quiz. After the quick quiz, do the online questions for Part D, Chapter 7. It will be good practice because the online questions are set out like the exam that you do at the end of the course. They will also test your knowledge of this chapter. Quick quiz. Question 1. What is the name given to the costing method where the cost of goods sold and the value of closing inventory include an element of indirect costs or overheads? A. Absorption costing. B. Allocation costing. C. Apportionment costing. D. Activity-based costing. Question 2. Which one of the following is the formula for calculating an overhead absorption rate? A. Actual activity level divided by budgeted total overhead. B. Budgeted activity level divided by budgeted total overhead. C. Budgeted total overhead divided by budgeted activity level. D. Budgeted total overhead divided by actual activity level. Question 3. Put the following stages of absorption costing into the correct order. A. Reapportionment. B. Allocation. C. Absorption. D. Apportionment. Question 4. HCO bases its overhead absorption rate on labor hours. The following information is available for 20x9. Budgeted overheads 600,000 rands. Actual overheads 660,000 rands. Budgeted labor hours 120,000. Actual labor hours 110,000. Calculate the over or under absorption of overheads for 20x9. A. 60,000 rands over absorbed. B. 60,000 rands under absorbed. C. 110,000 rands over absorbed. D. 110,000 rands under absorbed. Question 5. Overabsorption occurs when absorbed overheads are greater than actual overheads. True or false? After doing the quick quiz, do the online questions for Part D, Chapter 7. Do the questions, until you achieve 80%. Replay the lecture as needed.